I'm Jon Stika. Right now I'm retired from NRCS. I was a soil health instructor with them for many years. I work part-time at the NDSU Research Extension Center in Dickinson, helping out with their agronomy stuff, soil health things. I just started as a brewer at Fatfish Brewing in Dickinson this spring. So I've got a number of things going on, but I've been talking about soil health since 1992 and wrote a book, Soil Owner's Manual, How to Restore Soil Health. And so I've been interested in this and talking about this for a long time. So it's interesting. It'll be fun to be here today and talk to people about this on the scale of edible landscapes as well as the bigger picture of farming and ranching. They asked me to cover the basics of soil health, why it's important, what the principles are, how those principles apply no matter where you are. If you're talking about a square foot in your garden or 1,000 acres on your ranch, the principles are the same. So just laying those out for people to help them understand the basics no matter how they're going to apply those, so that people can actually implement or begin to implement changes to improve their soil health. And as the soil improves, then the plants improve as far as their nutritional quality. So you have healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy people. The whole thing is tied together. No matter what you're raising, if you're going to eat what's growing on that soil, or you're going to raise animals that are eating what's growing on that soil, it's all connected, and it's all part of soil health all the way to our health. Just an update on what Nolan said. Now he's got me distracted to talk about beer. This spring I went pro. I'm actually a professional brewer. There's a brewery that started up in Dickinson that roped me into running their brewery for them. So that's been kind of interesting. That's a big learning curve, but it also involves a lot of microbiology, which, as you'll see, is a big part of soil health. So happy to be here this morning. Every once in a while, Jay or somebody talks me into, they pull me out of the trees and get me to talk about this stuff again. The first soil health presentation I did was back in 1992, which might be before some of you were born, which is a good thing. But as I look out at the group right now, I see a lot of faces that I don't know, people that I've never met before, and that's great. I think that's great that I see that interest among people that I haven't talked to or haven't seen before. So, but what Nolan Jay asked me to do today was kind of lay the groundwork, the foundation, the basics of soil health. And those principles apply no matter where you are or what you're doing. If you're talking about a square foot in your garden, or you're talking about 1,000 acres on a ranch, the principles are all the same. And as you listen to all the other speakers at this conference today and tomorrow, if you keep coming back to the basics, you'll see the reasons why these people are doing things the way that they're doing them. They're going to talk to you about how things get done that apply these principles and why it matters, how it affects your food, how it affects everything. So we'll go through some of the basics, big scale, smaller scale, and hopefully by the time we're through here, you'll have a good foundation to build off of. But the first thing that I wanted to mention, and that I found out over the years doing this, is it involves a lot of change in thinking. And change always comes with uncertainty, and our brains process that as something negative, that as an error, so we resist it. But if we don't change our thinking,
about the soil, which is really my goal and has been for a long time. If you don't change your thinking, nothing else is going to change with it. So you're going to have to accept that uncertainty and find your own way to experiment and explore some of these things so that you can start to see that, yes, this is really the way the soil was designed to function. Okay, so keep that in mind. You know, we have to go through this paradigm shift and find our way through how we're going to do this. And when I stopped tilling my garden 20 years ago, I thought, you know, to myself, well, I don't know if this is going to work. You know, this is not looking good right up front. But as I stuck with it and kept going, and now I look at it and realize if I tilled my garden now, it would be just total destruction. It would just be horrible. So everyone has to go through that and learn how to deal with that change. So what is soil health? And when I work with any group, you know, the emphasis is that the soil is alive. I work with groups of school kids, you know, 5th graders, probably the last group, and I ask them, what's the difference between soil and dirt? And I tell them that dirt is what's on the bottom of your shoes. Dirt is what comes off your clothes when you put them in the washing machine. Soil is alive. That's the difference. And as soon as we shift our thinking to understand that the soil is alive and everything that lives in it is what makes it function, then we approach it in a completely different way. We think about how do we nurture what lives there, how do we restore what's supposed to live there and get it to function again, and get away from a thinking of we need to just manipulate this and supply all these inputs and try and make this be what we want it to be. Instead, it's let's make this come alive again, come back to what it was supposed to be or what it was in the first place. So when we talk about soil health, the same as human health, we're talking about function. And when you go to the doctor, they're basically assessing your capacity to function. How well are you functioning today? And then you go into the, well, okay, except my foot hurts, or whatever the case might be. And so the doctor assesses your function and then tries to find ways to restore that function. So soil health is no different. We're looking at how well is this soil functioning, and if it's not functioning very well, how do we restore that? And the key is understanding it as a living system. It's a biological system. So if we start to look at a little bigger picture, if we have healthy soil, we'll have healthy plants, we'll have healthy landscapes, we'll have healthy people or healthy animals that are eating those plants, whatever the case might be. But we need to start from that foundation to get the soil healthy. Otherwise, the plants aren't going to be healthy. The plants aren't going to get what they need unless all their biological partners are there supplying them and creating an environment that they can get what they need. And I believe a few of the other speakers are going to touch on that. These plants can't acquire what they need to acquire, and therefore it won't be in the plants when we decide we're going to eat them. So this all ties together. And we have to get the soil to function first. So zooming out to a little bit bigger picture, We talk about things like the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, all of those things. And for those of you that are familiar with those cycles or parts of those cycles, they all go through the soil. All those cycles have some part or some major part where that cycle goes through the soil, happens through the soil. So if the soil's not functioning, how can we expect the hydrologic cycle to function? How can we expect the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle? How can we expect those to function? There's a little disconnect where we don't realize that that's how all those things happen. If all the water runs off of the soil, how can you have a hydrologic cycle? So the soil has to perform those functions, or all of these things start to break down. And we have nutrients in the wrong places. We have water in places that don't do us any good or don't do the plants any good, etc. We have to think about that has to go through the soil. So it comes down to, if the soil's not happy, nobody's happy. Okay, everybody's heard that phrase, if mom's not happy, nobody's happy. Okay? If the soil's not happy, nobody's happy. And you can't expect any of these other cycles. You can't expect what you're growing or anything that you expect to happen that involves the soil to happen if the soil's not functioning. And it's one of those, one of my friends, Ray Archuleta, said it's a BFO, it's a blinding flash of the obvious. That if that soil's not functioning, how can you expect the rest of this to work? We can't take that for granted, that these things are happening. So water infiltration and transmission in the soil, and that depends on aggregates, which depends on soil biology. So soil is a living system. That's not happening. Hydrologic cycle isn't going to work. Water's going to run off. It's not going to go in the soil. It's not going to be available to plants. It's not going to be stored. All these things we expect to happen. The carbon cycle. How well is carbon cycling? We look at a crop field and we see residue out there that's 3 years old. Plant residue that's out there 3-4 years. That's not supposed to be laying out there yet. That's supposed to be cycling. Yes, we want the soil covered, but we don't want that residue to be out there forever. That particular crop residue to be out there forever. It's supposed to be cycling. The nitrogen cycle. Are we going to rely on a natural nitrogen cycle that's run by plants and by soil organisms, or are we going to artificially supply everything? Both of them will work. We can produce crops either way, but one of them is going to get pretty expensive. So a conversation Jay and I had last night was, how long do you want to farm? How long do you expect to farm? If it's short term, well, then maybe it's okay if these cycles aren't really working. We'll just supply everything. We'll irrigate, we'll add fertilizer, we'll do all these things. That's short term. But if we're going to regenerate the soil so it can actually do what it's supposed to do without all of those inputs, and rely instead on natural systems instead of input artificial systems, then we can farm a lot longer, maybe forever. Okay? So it's important to understand that there's different ways of looking at this, and if you're really going to commit yourself to restoring soil function, now we're talking about farming, gardening, whatever, for the long term. So once again, soil is a biological system. And here's the nice diagram that stole from the soil biology primer. I think everybody has stolen this one at one time or another, but it's a really good diagram. And I like to use it to torture people about 7th grade science. So I'm going to take you back to 7th grade science class, and we're going to go through this, and it's going to be painful. But there's things that we need to understand that are important in here. And it's a little bit of an oversimplified diagram. But we have the sun, we have plants, we have soil, we have organic matter, we have the small organisms in the soil, and then the ever-increasing levels, trophic levels of larger organisms. But what's really key in this whole thing is the soil system, our system of production, the system of how plants and the organisms that live in the soil acquire their energy is, it's supposed to be from the sun. Okay? This is supposed to be solar power. It's not supposed to be fossil fuel powered. It's not supposed to be powered by some other external source. It's supposed to be powered by the sun. So this linkage between solar energy and green plants and photosynthesis is boring, but it's critical. That's how the energy gets into the soil for all the rest of what's supposed to happen in the soil, to have everybody to be fed. And if we're not taking advantage of that, if we don't have that working, whichever part of this is broken, if it's the fact that we don't have green plants out there, if we don't have soil that those plants can live in and acquire water from, if we're missing some vital component of our soil biology, if any or all of those things are broken, it's going to cost us more and more and more money and inputs to try and supplement the energy that we're supposed to be capturing from the sun. So the sun shines on green plants. The green plants do photosynthesis. They make sugars. Those sugars move into the soil, feed the soil organisms. The soil organisms all grow, reproduce, eat each other, make nutrients available back to the plants so the plants can continue to grow. The organisms create stable aggregates to make a good environment for the plants to grow. That's how it's designed to function. Okay? And we need to understand that it's simple. It's a very simple thing, but we need to pay attention to that. Those of you that drive a gasoline engine vehicle or a diesel powered vehicle, or you have one of each in your household like I do, okay? It's important that you put diesel fuel in the diesel powered vehicle and gasoline in the gasoline powered vehicle. If you put the wrong fuel in, they'll run, sort of, for a while. That's modern agriculture right now. That's the state that our soils are in. We're putting the wrong fuel in and expecting this thing to run. And it wasn't designed to run that way. It was designed to run on sunshine, on solar power. So it's important that we keep that in mind, that you need to run things, whether it's an engine or whether it's a soil, you need to run them the way they were designed to run. Not the way we want to run them, but the way they were designed to run. So, as we go through the rest of this, you'll see the importance of that linkage and how that works. Okay, so just the relative number of organisms, bacteria and actinomycetes, you see all those zeros behind there. And none of us can comprehend the number of organisms. You grab a nice piece of functioning soil that's maybe the diameter of a nickel. There's as many organisms in there as there are people on Earth right now. Okay, it's billions. It's hard to comprehend that. But when you start to think about the whole soil on an acre, or whatever the case might be, the number of organisms. Okay, everyone has livestock. Everyone has livestock in their system. A lot of them you can't see without a microscope. And if you want to have fun, get a microscope and start looking at some of these. But everyone has livestock, and they're all fed through these green plants and through their root systems. That's how the carbon gets in the soil. It's not necessarily from residues that are left on top or things that we add. It's from the sugars in those root systems. That's how your livestock get fed. And if you could round up all those critters, all those microscopic critters, on every acre, if you have pretty well functioning soil, they would weigh somewhere between 2 cows and 2 elephants. So it's pretty significant when you think about 2 cows standing on every acre that have to be fed. It's just that they live underground. And they're still there. They're still trying to do what they're supposed to do, but they need to be fed. They need to be part of our thinking. Okay, so we ask people, what functions do you expect your soil to perform? And it doesn't matter if we're talking about a garden, if we're talking about a quarter section of wheat, of 1,000-acre rangeland, whatever the case is, the answer is always the same. We want to grow plants. Okay? Like I just mentioned, we're trying to take advantage of that solar energy. We're trying to capture that and make that into something that we can sell. Whether it's grain, or beef, or chicken, or pork, or corn, or whatever the case might be. So if we're trying to grow healthy plants, because healthy plants are the cheapest thing to grow, they require the fewest inputs, okay? Then we expect that soil to infiltrate water. Plants need water. We expect that soil to supply those plants with nutrients. And the soil can, believe it or not, the soil can supply everything that a plant needs. Everything. For a very, very long time. If it's functioning. And you'll hear me say that over and over. If the soil is functioning, if the biology is there, this is what the soil can do. It's hard for people to comprehend that and believe that because most of us have not seen the functioning soil. We've seen a lot of degraded soils that require a lot of inputs, but most of us have not seen a functioning soil. But the soil can do all of those things. It really can, if it's set up to function. So, soil functions as a biological system. We talk about plant nutrient immobilization and mineralization and nutrient cycling, and we can get into all the chemistry, the reduction, the oxidation, all those things. Okay, I'm a nerd. I admit it. I have been for years, and I can go on about this stuff forever. Ask my wife. But what's important to understand is, since it's a biological system, and since we have to have the whole array of biology, from bacteria and fungi all the way to nematodes and everybody else, we need to have a huge diversity of environments in the soil that come from stable aggregates in the soil. And you'll hear that word a lot today and tomorrow, is diversity. In order for these things to happen, for these nutrient cycles to happen. So we have our stable soil aggregates, Okay? And a soil aggregate is just a lump or a clump of soil that holds together when it gets wet. Okay? That's a short definition. So the water can move into the soil. If the soil aggregates are not stable, if they fall apart at the soil surface when it rains, if they fall apart there, they plug the system and the water can't move into the soil. And then you have runoff. Okay? So we get water to move into the soil. We have habitat for the whole soil food web. So nutrient cycling actually happens. Because nutrient cycling can't happen with just bacteria or just fungi. You have to have bacteria, fungi. You have to have all the predators for nutrient cycling to really work. We have roots that are able to move and explore the soil easily and connect with these other organisms. And then we have some of the larger organisms that are the predators that have spaces that they can move around in the soil, and also air exchange. You have to have oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. The soil needs to be able to breathe to a certain extent also. So these are all the biological things that have to happen that depend on stable soil aggregates. So if we really boil this down, I keep emphasizing biology. If you ask the soil biologists, they'll tell you that 90% of the environmentally and agronomically important soil functions that I just talked about are carried out by soil organisms and by plants. Okay? That's how important this is. That's how this is supposed to function. That's what reduces our inputs. Okay? So we have a lot of these organisms that live in the soil make some kind of glue. They're sticky, and they start to stick sand, silt, and clay particles together to start to build these aggregates, to bring the soil together into these little lumps and clumps that allow for the spaces, for the water, for the air to move through the soil. And these aggregates are places for things to live and places where carbon gets stored, etc. But these microbes need to be fat to make good aggregates. So we're not talking about just having these organisms present. They need to be fed to do their job. Like any worker. So your workers can show up and, okay, they're all here, but nobody fed any of these workers today, so they're not going to get much done, sorry. So we need to make sure that we not only get all the biology there, get them present, but we have to keep feeding them. And that's that linkage between the sun and green plants, getting that energy into the soil. So we talk about soil structure. As a soil scientist, we talk about soil structure, and that's what I mean by aggregates. And when I harvested my carrots this fall out of my garden, there was quite a bit of soil that was still clinging to those carrots. I knocked most of it off. But then I threw the carrots in a bucket of water to wash the rest of the soil off. So I proceeded to do that, taking the carrots out, washing them off a little bit, getting them out of the bucket. Then when I went to dump the water out of the bucket, I went over to the garden and I poured it out. And the picture with my Leatherman laying next to it there was those aggregates. Okay, they survived me beating them around in that bucket, washing those carrots off for several minutes before I dumped them out on the ground, and it looked like a pile of black cottage cheese. Okay? Those are stable aggregates. If you can smash them around in a bucket of water for several minutes and they don't fall apart, those are stable aggregates. That's what we're after. That's what we want. We want those aggregates to stay together when they get wet. We want them to stay together no matter what. So when we look at how those aggregates are built, if we disturb the soil, we disrupt the soil biological community, we disrupt their ability to build the glues that make the aggregates. They'll start to eat some of the glue, so our aggregates start to fall apart. So you can't make soil aggregates with tillage. Only soil biology can make aggregates. You can break aggregates apart with tillage, but you can't make aggregates with tillage. So tillage results in a very big disruption and a poor environment. And if that's part of your system, that's okay, but you need to understand and mitigate for that. Okay? So if you have to do that for some other purpose, you have some other purpose, whether it's weed control or whatever the case might be, you have to realize the damage that does and be able to mitigate that so you get back on the positive side in the big picture. Okay, so the rhizosphere, the next part that I want to talk about, if you want to impress people, you can start talking about rhizospheres and they'll think you're really a science geek, but it's where the roots meet the soil. And that's really where the most activity is. A lot of the soil, the bulk soil, is kind of asleep. Okay? It's at a pretty low state of function until a root shows up or an earthworm shows up. And then it wakes everybody up and it feeds everybody and the party gets going. Okay? So the image there is some barley plants that I dug up. They were actively growing plants. I dug them up and just gave them a few shakes, and all the soil fell off except this nice coating on all the roots. And the roots are all nice and white, so they're healthy. But that plant is exuding sugar out of its root system and feeding the soil biology around it. And that's what's causing all that soil to remain, to stick around those roots. So you can see the rhizosphere. You can see it's all stuck to the roots yet. But that's this concentrated area of activity where the energy is being transferred from the sun through that green plant into the soil. So even if you don't have a microscope, you can still see some of these things, the results of some of these things happening in the soil. So if we're going to manage for soil health, now that we understand some of the basics, how do we do this? How do we manage for this? So one of the things we need to look at is what's the most limiting element in the soil for sustainable production. And if you would have asked me this 20 years ago, I would have said nitrogen. That's what we're spending money on. That's what we're applying out there. It's got to be nitrogen. It's carbon. Okay? Carbon is the currency of the soil. It's the glue. It's the way energy is transferred in the soil from these green plants. So we need to think about how do we get carbon into the soil through living plants that will power the rest of the system. That will power the rest of the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the hydrologic cycle, all of those things. If you think about it, the Earth's atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. There's plenty of nitrogen. There's no shortage of it. There's plenty of phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. There's plenty of this stuff around. There's some local differences in the soil as to how much is there. But all of these things can be made available to the plants through the biology that lives in the soil. Ultimately, that's where we're headed, or that's where we need to be headed. Now, are we going to use some fertilizer to get there? Probably. We're going to need to have some help, some tools along the way to get there. But ultimately, we can get there. The soil can do that. And as we increase organic matter, we increase our soil water holding capacity, which is critical even this year when it was so wet. We still want to hold that water so it's not all running off or ponding or causing problems somewhere else. And the other thing we need to understand is that if we're going to apply nutrients, particularly nitrogen, only about a third of what we apply as fertilizer ever actually ends up in the plant. Okay, the soil biology get it first, and then where it goes from there remains to be seen. The plant's obviously going to respond to some of that, but we have to understand how the nitrogen cycle deals with that, which is a whole nother topic. But if we look at all of what we would call soil organic matter, the black stuff, the black material in the soil, about 10% of that by weight is alive, is the living part of it that does all of these things that we expect the soil to do. Okay, so managing soil biology to achieve soil health. And I want to lay out for you just the 4 principles that I use. Depending on who you ask, there's 5 principles, 6 principles, and that's fine. You know, I mean, we can debate those all day, and I think it's great that we're looking at this and thinking about this. The 4 principles that I look at or that I use is minimize disturbance of the soil, maximize the diversity of the plants that you're growing in the soil, keep living roots in the soil as much as possible, okay, capturing solar energy as much as possible, and keep the soil covered with plants or their residues as much of the time as possible. And it may be difficult to achieve all 4 of these things to perfection all the time. You know, are you always going to have the soil covered? Maybe, maybe not. Are you always going to have living roots? You know, those, but to think about how we can minimize disturbance and maximize diversity and maximize living roots and maximize keeping the soil covered. And what that all boils down to is we're trying to create the most favorable habitat for the soil food web. That's really all this is. If you apply those 4 principles, you keep the soil biology happy, the rest of this should work. Okay? Now, if it's a garden, if it's a crop field, if it's grazing land, principles are all the same. You just need to figure out how to apply. The devil's in the details. How am I going to apply this? How am I going to do this? And for every operation, it's going to be different. So let's look at each one of these just a little bit more detail. You know, what is soil disturbance? And there's physical disturbance where you can till the soil. You know, you can dig it up, you can break it up, you can break the aggregates apart, you can disrupt the world of all these organisms that live in the soil. You can physically disrupt them. There's chemical disruption, where you can apply a fertilizer that now short circuits some cycle that the biology we're doing or we're trying to do, and by applying that fertilizer, that could have shortchanged something and maybe done just as much harm as good. The plants may respond ultimately, but we have to realize whatever it is we're adding to the soil, how does that affect the overall soil biology? And then there's biological disturbance, a lack of plant diversity, a lack of food or cover. Okay, and you know, there again is that diversity. So, and you have to have different plants that provide a different diet, a different type of food to all these organisms. If If I told everyone in this room that for the next month, all you could eat are donuts, there'd be a number of people like, cool, I've been waiting for somebody to tell me that. After about 2 or 3 days, you would hate donuts. After a month, you would not be very healthy. Okay? Any more than if I said for the next month, everybody has to eat nothing but broccoli. You can't do that. You have to have this diversity. And that's the diversity of diet to the soil food web that plants bring. If you always grow the same plant all the time, you're putting your soil biology on this diet of one thing all the time. And yeah, they can survive, but they could do a whole lot better if they had a diverse diet. So we talk about maximizing plant diversity. What is plant diversity? What do you mean by that? And you can look at a crop rotation, the sequence of plants that are grown on the same piece of ground from one year to the next. And we have cool season and warm season plants. We have broadleaf plants. We have grasses. We can mix them all together into cover crops and get a whole bunch of diversity in one shot. We can have, jumped ahead of myself there. We can have a diverse rotation, or we can have a whole bunch of diversity all in one shot with a cover crop, or plants in perennial plants in a grazing system. Okay? So we look at this part of the world, we go out on native rangeland, and we count the number of different species of plants that are out there. There's 100 or so. That's the diversity that built the soil in the first place. That's the diversity that nature put out there to build soil in the first place. So then we look at our crop rotations, and oh wow, we should have 100 different plants in our crop rotation. That's a pretty tall order. But at least we can have more than 1 or 2 or 3. Can we shoot for 6 or 8 or 10 crops in our rotation or in our cover crops? Absolutely. No, that's not that difficult. So we need to think about getting as much diversity out there as we possibly can and have a lot of these different crops. So to have these living roots out there, the next principle, have these living roots out there, how much of the time do you have a living root out there? You say, well, this is North Dakota, our frost-free period is only 120 days. That's all the longer I can have a living root out there. No, there's living roots out there right now, today. There's a lot of native plants out there. There's perennial plants. There's winter wheat. There's winter rye. There's hairy vetch. All these plants. Their roots are still alive. If we get a warm day, they're going to do a little photosynthesis. They're going to feed the soil. If we get a cold day, maybe not so much. But to maximize that as much as possible. So look at diversity, cover crops, perennials, winter annuals, biennials, all these different things that are possible out there. Okay? Keep the soil covered. We need to physically protect the soil from the wind and from the sun. There's ultraviolet radiation that kills stuff. You go to the barber shop, he's got all of his combs and all of his tools sitting under an ultraviolet light. Okay? That's not just for looks. That kills stuff. Okay? If there's biology on those tools, it kills them. So protect the soil from the sun, from the wind, from the rain, etc. Put a roof on things, so to speak, so that biology has a place to live. The residue on the soil surface is a habitat of its own for a lot of organisms in the soil food that live up there, that eat weed seeds, that eat other insects. Conserve moisture, reduce soil temperatures. More often our crop yields are hindered by hot and dry conditions, not cool and wet, at least in this part of the world. And we want to keep the soil food web working. Okay, if the soil gets too dry, too hot, etc. That biology is still there, but they quit working. Okay? It's like having hired help that as soon as it gets really hot, they go and lay down under the shade tree. They're still there, but they're not getting anything done. We want them to keep working all the time. So the benefits of doing this, of managing for soil health: improved nutrient cycling. North Dakota State University has recognized a 50-pound nitrogen credit for long-term no-till. Okay, less soil disturbance, better nutrient cycling, better nutrient supply. Fungi in the soil, which are very sensitive to disturbance, increase phosphorus and water supply that they bring to the plants in exchange for sugar. Okay, so we see those inputs decrease. Those fertilizer inputs that we may have been using decrease. We may never get away from them, but it sure is nice to save a few bucks. Improve soil aggregation. So we have better water movement and storage in the soil, improved root growth. We have better habitat for the soil food web. We need lots of different pore sizes, lots of different habitats in the soil. Fewer weeds and diseases, especially as we increase the diversity of our crop rotations. And that's been known forever. Any of you read any of the stuff that Thomas Jefferson wrote about his gardening and his farming and the diverse rotations that he had and cover crops that he grew were for those reasons. And we kind of got away from that, but that doesn't mean that that still isn't true. So we have fewer weeds and diseases as we have more diversity and our soil starts to function again. And like I mentioned, this economics. We have to do less out there. We have to apply less. We have to buy less to keep things working, to keep our plants growing. The soil can do that for us. So how do we know if soil health is improving? And there's lots of ways you can measure that. Soil aggregate stability increases. I showed you the aggregates that I dumped out of my bucket after I harvested my carrots. That's a pretty good indicator. Take some of your soil aggregates off the top inch or two, let them dry out for a while, throw them in some water. If they fall apart in less than 3 minutes, you got work to do. Okay? If they hold together for a long time, you're in pretty good shape. So that's a pretty easy measure. Water infiltration. Put some water on the soil and see if does it keep infiltrating, or does it just pond up and build up? Okay? If I take the hose out to my garden and I just stand in one spot and water, the water will just keep going in. It'll go in, it'll go in, it'll go in, until the earthworms start coming out and saying, "What the? Are you trying to drown me?" They will. They'll actually come up and look at me. What are you trying to do? So that's an easy way to measure it. Organic matter, you can just look at the color of the soil. You can have that measured. Your crop response. How well do your crops grow without fertilizer? Leave a check strip. Find out. If they do really well without any additional fertilizer, your soil food web is probably functioning pretty good. And then see, okay, I'm reducing inputs. Things are still growing pretty well. Soil must be functioning pretty well. You can do some biological analysis, soil food web analysis that will tell you, here's the organisms that are living in your soil right now. And see if everybody's there. See if you have the whole soil food web and what kind of numbers you have. Okay, so now kind of bringing it down a little bit, edible landscapes, which is what we're talking about today. These are some shots from my yard that I took this summer. And I have a vegetable garden. And I have wine grapes. And I have raspberries and strawberries, apples, hops, of course. Those of you who don't know what hops are, they're an ingredient in beer. And then the lawn, which to me is kind of useless because I don't eat grass. But it needs to kind of look nice, okay? No fertilizer. I haven't put fertilizer on my lawn. I don't remember if I ever have. But I have 2 locust trees on my front lawn, which are legumes. They're leguminous trees. So they're supplying some nitrogen to my lawn. They're also providing shade, which Kentucky bluegrass loves. So I don't water my lawn usually ever. If it gets a little dry and it starts to go dormant, that's fine. You know, it'll only be for a little while until it rains again. But all of these things, you know, if you think about how to get the soil to function as well as it can, like the lawn, mow it high and let it lie, leave the grass clippings out there. And people come and walk across my lawn and they go, oh, it's so rough. You know, all the worms, the worm middens, you know, have made everything so rough. And I said, yeah, isn't that awesome? You know, they're taking care of things out there. I don't need to put fertilizer out there. I don't need to run that little thing that plugs holes out of the soil and all that stuff. The biology can do that. So, you know, you can apply this to no matter what you're growing or what you have, even in a small scale. And my lot isn't that big. My lot is 75 by 150, and my house takes up half of that. So you can grow lots of food out there. So building soil health into your lawn and edible landscapes, don't till the soil as far as the garden goes. Smother the weeds instead of killing them with herbicides. Plant with minimal disturbance. I just take a shovel, take the edge of the blade, make a little scratch in the soil, put my seed in. That's all the more you need to disturb it. Pull the weeds rather than hoeing them, which disturbs the soil and plants more weed seeds. Use mulch to suppress your weeds and cover the soil. My neighbors on both sides of me mow their lawn and bag their grass clippings. And now in Dickinson, you can't throw them in the trash. They won't pick them up at the street. You have to take them to the recycle bins where they'll then take them and compost them. So my neighbor thinks it's great. Mow his lawn, bag the clippings, put them in big trash cans, and he leaves them for me, and I put them in my garden. And I do that all summer long, constantly. And I still can't keep the soil covered because the biology just keeps eating those grass clippings as fast as I put them out there. So I think it's great because I get all kinds of soil cover and everything that comes with it. And he thinks it's great because he didn't have to haul his grass clippings. And I'm thinking someday he's going to figure out when he watches me mow my lawn that I'm not bagging my clippings, that he doesn't need to do that, but I'm not going to bring that up. Follow early crops with a second or cover crop. You know, I grow barley in my garden. I don't eat the barley. It's just there to have living roots during times when I don't or wouldn't have living roots. I already mentioned the mow it high and let it lie as far as the lawn. And lots of diversity. You know, don't plant those tomatoes in the same spot every year. Don't plant the corn in the same spot every year. And then invite as many living things as you can. You know, I have the little bat house. I built one of those. Birds, I always have water out for the birds. I don't feed them during the summer. I want them to eat insects in my garden. Pollinators, have lots of flowers. The little bee block, we drill the holes in there so they have places. Some of them have places to lay their eggs. So I want insects there. I want everybody there. So they all do their thing. They all play their part. You know, as I go down the road, I have fewer weeds. The worst weed in my garden right now are trees, okay? A perennial plant, because I'm not tilling the soil. They can get established, so that's a challenge pulling them out. But so I have fewer weeds, use less and less herbicide. I don't think I've put any herbicide on my garden in a few years now, and I probably won't. increased soil biology, no fertilizer. I haven't put any fertilizer on my garden in decades. Earthworms. I did actually dig up a cubic foot of soil. My kids give me a hard time, like, Dad, you're such a geek. You're the only guy that would ever do something like that. Dig up a cubic foot of soil and count how many earthworms are in there. And the last time I did it, there were 75. Right now, I don't know how many are there. I mean, I have a friend who likes to go fishing. He goes over to his dad's place and he digs in his garden and he can't find any worms and he keeps coming over to my place. Can I dig for worms? And he digs 2 shovelfuls of soil and he's got all the worms that he wants. And it's less work. It's less work, more and better food, as you get the soil to do what it's supposed to do. So, kind of wrap things up. Soil health is the capacity of the soil to function, and how we expect the soil to function. Soil is a biological system. If you can wrap your mind around that and do everything according to that, you'll get somewhere. You'll get the soil to function again. And most of what lives in the soil is microscopic. You can't see them unless you get a microscope and look at them that way. And it's plants that fix soil. There's no soil amendment that will fix your soil. They can be used as tools to help you along the way. But only plants can actually fix the soil and sustain it, sustain the aggregates and sustain the soil biology, because they're the ones that are putting that carbon into the soil in that way. So you think about the principles: less disturbance, more diversity, living roots as much of the time as possible, and keep the soil covered and apply those however you're going to apply it. And it's going to be different for everybody's situation. We can restore soil. They've all been degraded, but now we're talking about restoring them. Not just getting a yield, not just preventing erosion, talking about actually restoring soil, getting it to function again. Okay? So when I retired in 2015, people were telling me, okay, you know all this stuff. Did you ever write it down? So I wrote it down. I wrote it down in a little book. It's only 106 or 7 pages. Very approachable. Anybody can understand it. Basically covers what I just said this morning. You can find it on Amazon. I brought a few copies with if you want to get a copy from me, but I did write it down. So now everybody can quit bugging me about that and look at the book. So with that, I don't know if we're going to do questions now or later. Where did Nolan go? Oh.
Does anybody have any questions? I think we can take a couple.
Yes, sir.
On the, I like what you said and I agree with it, but it seems that a lot of agronomists, they've got their maps made from soil substrates and that, and yet if you go out, you can look at the same soil on one side of the field or on one side of the fence, then you look on the other side of the fence, 2 different producers, and it looks like it's altogether different soil depending on how it's been treated for years. But is there a simple measure that, other than maybe simple organic matter in the soil, that you can say, this has got a good, healthy soil, this is not so much, but it's clearly not the same even though the map shows it the same?
Probably the 3 easiest measures that you can do without spending any money or without sampling the soil or sending it somewhere. Collect some soil aggregates from the surface, let them dry out, and then drop them in some water and see how long they hold together. And you can take a ring of some kind, We used to use coffee cans when they put coffee in cans, but a piece of irrigation pipe or well casing or something like that, take about a 6-inch piece of that, pound it into the soil, 2 or 3 inches, and pour. If you take a bottle of water like this and you drink one good slug out of it, there'll be enough water left in there that it'll be 1 inch of water in a 6-inch ring. And see how long it takes for that to infiltrate, that water infiltration rate. And if you're on a really poor soil, it'll be really boring because you'll be standing there a long time waiting for that water to go in. But you can time it and see how long does it take this inch of water to go in. And then the third thing is to dig up some soil and look for earthworms. Because the earthworms are kind of one of the top predators in the soil, and they won't be there unless all the rest of the soil food web is there for them to feed off of. So aggregate stability, water infiltration, earthworms, those are 3 really easy ones that you can actually get some kind of a number, if you want a number. How long did it take the water to infiltrate? How long the aggregates hold together in water? How many earthworms do I have? And you can track that or compare that. But those are 3 pretty easy ones that can tell you how well is the biology functioning expressed as aggregate stability, earthworm presence. And years ago, when I mapped soils in Illinois, some of the best soils on the planet, I dug thousands of holes mapping soils, never saw an earthworm. Never saw an earthworm. Now we're seeing earthworms in some of these soils that haven't been tilled, that have diverse crop rotations on them. The earthworms are coming back. I mean, they've probably always been there, but they never had the biology to feed on. So those would be 3 that would be pretty easy measures. So I think I saw another hand over here somewhere.
I have a question about slugs because I like the idea of covering your soil with your neighbor's lawn clippings. I like that a lot, but if I do that in Fargo, North Dakota, I have gobs of slugs.
I have lots of slugs in my garden at times. There is a material that's made out of iron phosphate, and it's sold under different names like Slug Go or something like that. But it's iron phosphate, so it breaks down and you have more iron and phosphorus in your soil. I mean, it's not a poison. But that stuff works pretty good. Oh, you got a lot of slugs then, yeah.
Just, and I used to do a lot of mulching. I don't do as much mulching anymore because I don't want my soil as moist. Those little buggers are everywhere.
Well, yeah, and you'll have to strike a balance, maybe use a different kind of mulch or things like that. But yeah, they can be, there were some places in Oregon that they were a real issue. Yeah. And, the whole picking them by hand, that gets old. Putting salt on them. I don't really want my soil to be all salted up, right?
Ammonia is another thing that if you can see them, you can spray them with a combination of ammonia and water.
Yeah. No, they can be a problem. Good.